This is chapter 11 and 12 on principles of evolution and natural selection. So throughout this chapter, we'll look at how did evolutionary thought develop, how does natural selection work, how do we know evolution has occurred, and what is some evidence that populations evolve by this process of natural selection. So evolution is defined as the change over time in the characteristics of a population. So remember, it's a population that evolves, not an individual organism. So the population is defined as all the individuals in one species that inhabitate a particular area. So all of modern biology is based on this understanding that life has evolved over time. So this is a fairly new concept in human history. So this concept of evolution and change over time was mostly unrealized by early scientists. So this figure is just showing kind of a depiction of the tree of life, or evolutionary tree. So as you can see, closer to the base of the tree, these lower branches have much more simple organisms. As you get closer to the top of the tree, we increase in complexity in the types of organisms and diversity. So early biological thought didn't really include this concept of evolution. So like I said, it's a fairly new concept in our human history. So pre-Darwinian science was more heavily influenced by theological or religious ideals, basically all the same, maintaining that organisms were created simultaneously at one time during creation, and that each distinct organism and life form was permanently fixed and did not change. So it's always been this way. It hasn't changed. It's been, in this form, this type of organism since the dawn of creation. So now we know a lot more about the diversity of species around the world. So just kind of comparing our known and unknown. So the lighter gray ring is kind of our estimated, and the dark blue is kind of what we have actually discovered and documented. So as you can see, insects make up by far the majority of the types of diversity and the numbers of species that we see. So there are 1 million known species of insects, and it's estimated that there's probably 5 million total out there that have yet to be discovered, compared to mammals, birds, reptiles, right? Much lower species number, species density of these. So a good quote from a famous scientist, John Haldane, says, if one could conclude as to the nature of the Creator from a study of his creation, it would appear God has a special fondness for stars and beetles. So it's kind of funny to think about, just in sheer numbers of these objects on the earth and in the universe, beetles by far are the most common life form, probably next to bacteria, and stars are way more abundant in the universe than any other type of planets or bodies. So just kind of as an aside, I'm talking about evolution and species diversity. He's famous for kind of an origin of life experiment. So this here is showing the Haldane experiment. So he set up what was thought or theorized to be early Earth conditions. So remember, Earth is 4.6 billion years old at least, and life thought to have evolved maybe about 3 billion or so years ago. So we can look back and see kind of what the atmosphere, what the climate was like, and recreate those conditions. So he has some boiling water to add some water vapor to make an artificial atmosphere in one chamber. He has a lot of gases that were known to be present in the Earth's early atmosphere, and it applies electrical charges. So these are going to simulate electrical storms, lightning storms in the early Earth atmosphere. So this electrical energy is going to cause these gases and these molecules to interact and form new molecules. So then what we saw was a collection of amino acids and organic molecules after a few days in these conditions. So basically this just shows that it is theoretically possible for these organic molecules to kind of self-assemble in these early environmental conditions. It's just kind of interesting to think about. So exploration of new lands throughout human history ultimately revealed this staggering diversity of life, this wide range of diversity that we see today. So throughout European history, as they traveled and kind of conquered over the world, they were often accompanied by naturalists, which were kind of the early biologists and scientists back in the day. But these naturalists would observe and collect different plant and animal species from these new lands and kind of document all of the diversity we were discovering. So by the 1700s, we'd had accumulated a large scope of life's variety through pretty much all corners of the world. So ultimately, we saw that the number of species was far greater than what we could have ever expected or thought could be. So we also noticed some patterns in that certain geographic areas had their own sets of species. So like in Australia, right, you can find marsupials are more common, kangaroos, things like that, koalas, but they're not found anywhere else on Earth, right? So they're kind of special to that geographical location. And we also noticed that a lot of species closely resemble one another, but differ in some of their characteristics, right? So we could have brown bears in North America or South America, but then have polar bears, which are very similar, but slightly different for their particular habitat. So ultimately, these naturalists start to kind of notice these patterns and realize that they're inconsistent with that underlying previous idea that species were fixed and unchanging over time. Fossils are another point of evidence for current evolutionary thought. So fossil discoveries over time kind of showed us that life has actually changed over time, because the fossils that we were finding were much, much different than any current animal that we knew living today. So fossils are defined as just any preserved remains or traces of an organism that had died a long, long time ago. So this could include remains of actual bones, wood, of plants, shells, or just their impression. So maybe they can leave kind of a mold or an impression in the sediment. So fossils can also preserve traces like tracks, burrows, footprints, even pollen, eggs, and feces. So we have fossilized eggs, fossilized nests. Coprolites are fossilized feces. I'm not really sure how they determine that's what that is. So bones are an easy one. A lot of dinosaur bones have been discovered. Footprints and tracks, as well as skin impressions. So this has allowed us to kind of deduce what maybe their skin texture would have looked like. So again, these fossil discoveries have showed us that life has in fact changed over time. So we also noticed there was a significant pattern to the distribution of these fossils as they were being discovered. So one scientist, William Smith, studied these rock layers and the fossils embedded in each layer and recognized the pattern that certain fossils were always found in the same layers of rocks. So if we know by now current principles of geology that the way sediment lays and makes new layers of rock, so that would allow us to confer that these lower, deeper layers would be older rocks and the younger layers of rocks would be deposited on top. So we can also look and see kind of the gradual change in organisms throughout the layers. So the deepest layers, the oldest layers, would have these trilobites, kind of these very primitive early type organisms. A little bit higher, we have this plant or this fern fossil. And then higher above that, we would have a dinosaur fossil. So we can kind of deduce that dinosaurs lived more recently than the trilobites did. So again, this just shows that these remains show this progression through time, through geological time as well as biological time. So again, most of the fossils found in the oldest layers are very different from these modern organisms. So we can kind of see this complexity or resemblance to modern organisms kind of gradually increase as we get to the younger rocks, right? So kind of these earliest organisms, again, the trilobites, pretty much resemble almost no current modern organism, whereas some dinosaurs do show some similarities to modern reptiles and birds. Um, so we also know that now many of the fossilized species were extinct, which means there are no current organisms of that species living on Earth. So this also lends to the fact that species do change throughout time and are not unfixed, or not fixed and unchanging. So we just concluded that these organisms had to have lived during different time periods in the past. So again, countered the view that species were created kind of in one go round and then were fixed and unchanging afterward. So again, the study of geology has provided evidence that the Earth is extremely old. So 4.6 billion years old is the current estimate based on radioactive dating and some other geological concepts. But one geological concept of uniformitarianism helps to explain how our Earth's landscape was produced by past geological action. So, and these same geological processes occur today the same way that they have always occurred since the beginning of the Earth. So, what we know about geological processes today is that they are very slow, very long accumulating. So geology is a very long, drawn-out science. But based off of this, we can imply then that the Earth is very ancient to have all of the landscape that we have, all of the different rock layers. It must have taken a really, really, really long time to get to where we are now. So again, these rock strata or rock layers can demonstrate these processes. It's still occurring today. So over long periods of time, we can have these great changes in the terrain and the landscape. So when you look at kind of the side view of a mountain or a rock like this, these different layers represent different geological time periods. So we know now from plate tectonics that right, the Earth is very old and has been shifting the position of the land masses throughout its history. So starting with like Pangea, 150 million years ago, and then gradually every 10 million years or so, it shifts a little bit further and further. Also, another point of evidence is you can see how South America just fits nice and neatly into Africa, kind of like a puzzle piece. So this also kind of lets us conclude that these two land masses were once in ancient history connected at one point. This is another kind of geological process showing sedimentation and erosion. So mountains have broken down into smaller particles through just the process of weathering. So rain, ice breaks down the rocks and the minerals. They get washed down into the stream. So these rock particles get carried downstream and eventually will be deposited and form new layers of sediment. So over time, this can make new layers of rock, right? So essentially how the Grand Canyon was formed. So river kind of gradually throughout millions and millions of years, these slow geological processes cut through to form that deep, deep canyon. So this is another figure showing kind of this gravity separation in deposition. So again, the particles are made up of things like heavy gravels. You have some like sand particles and some really light, like silty clay particles. So these three particles are going to deposit in different layers. So the heavier particles, like the gravels and the boulders, are going to sink to the bottom first. So they're going to make up the bottom layers, the first layers. Then on top of that, you have the sand, which is kind of the intermediate weight in size. And then finally the clay and just the real smooth, soft mud and silt and clay on the very top. So the lightest particles will sit and settle on the top layers. So Darwin and Wallace are considered the fathers of evolution and natural selection. So they're the ones that kind of came up with this process, this idea for evolution. Right? So using finches in the Galapagos Island, they came up with pretty convincing evidence that evolution was driven by these simple yet powerful processes. So we already knew that life was much more diverse than we ever thought possible. So naturalists started to wonder that there may be some other principle kind of driving, some kind of force behind this diversity that we've seen. Um, and then Darwin is quoted as saying it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. So the better you can adapt to your environment, the better off you're going to be, the more you're going to survive. So with their studies, island populations are very different. So they have different food sources, different type of predators, different communities and populations. So what they noticed was these different finches from different islands had different characteristics. So obviously they're related, they're all finches, but they do have these slight differences. So each finch over time, over many generations, kind of on these secluded islands, they have adapted more specifically for that island environment. So the island environment over here could be different from over here. So food supplies, types of predators, etc. So this is showing just some of the variations that they noted between the types of birds. So birds that were more adapted to eating seeds had these kind of stout, fat beaks that were good for cracking open those hard seeds. As opposed to the bird that's going to primarily eat insects. It has a more sharp, narrower beak, so it's better at kind of piercing through those insects. The fruit-eating finch has more of a curved beak, right, to help it eat the fruit better. Grubs, again, the sharp, pointy beak. Right, so these finches have kind of specialized for their particular habitat. And thus kind of showing this principle of evolution by natural selection. So the theory of evolution by natural selection that Darwin came up with rests on four postulates, or four kind of underlying principles. So number one is that individuals in a population vary. So we already know this. Right? So even in humans, we're all the same species, but we're all different. Right? We're all unique. There is wide variation. So a lot of these traits that make us different are heritable. So they're able to be passed on from parent to offspring. Right? So through the DNA, the actual genetic material. So ultimately, some individuals in a population will be more successful at reproducing and surviving than others. Others will fail to survive and reproduce. So Darwin's postulates state that the survival and reproduction success rate are not determined by chance. It's determined by these traits that the individual has that either give it an advantage or disadvantage in its particular habitat. So again, kind of evolution in a nutshell. So these mutations are constantly occurring. So mistakes in copying, other types of mutations. Right. So something changing the genome. So if we change the DNA, that's going to change what protein is being made and what function or structure that organism will have. Right. So since these mutations and these traits are in the DNA, that means that they can be passed to offspring in the next generation. So individuals with particular mutations may survive and reproduce more than others. So over time, the population would evolve. So the more offspring you can make, the more copies of your genes are in the population and the more they can spread. So over time, this process or buildup of mutations results in a population that is very specialized for its ecological niche. So an ecological niche is just kind of its specific habitat and type of diet. So eventually results in emergence of new species, like we saw with the finches. So their beaks had changed to kind of suit their particular diet on their individual islands. So again, natural selection modifies a population over time, not an individual. Right? So an individual can have a mutation, but that is not evolution. So that particular mutation has to be more widespread over the population to be considered evolution by natural selection. So it acts on individuals, but it modifies the population over time. Right? So not all mutations, right, not all variations are beneficial. Right? So you could have a negative mutation, so that's going to decrease your chance in surviving and reproducing. So ultimately, over the generations, the population will change as the percentage of individuals inheriting that favorable or that advantageous trait increases. So an individual cannot evolve, but a population can. So a common example is with giraffes. So why do giraffes have such long necks? So each species shows variation. So we have some shorter necked giraffes and our longer necked giraffes. Right? So these two species, or these two individuals of the same species, are going to compete. So they're in the same habitat. So they're competing for the same resources like food, living space, water, mates, etc. So whichever of the individuals is better adapted to this particular habitat, these demands of the habitat are going to be more likely to survive. So the longer necked giraffes are better at obtaining food and nutrients. The shorter necked giraffes are going to eventually starve and die off. So they're not going to be able to reproduce if they can't eat. Right, so over time, our long-necked survivors pass on their better genes to the offspring who will also show this beneficial variation. So the short-necked giraffes die off, and over time, all we have are the long-necked giraffes. So another example with beetles. So in this example, the birds like to eat the green beetles. They don't really like the red beetles as much. So over time, the green beetles are going to be killed more. So it's not beneficial to be a green beetle any longer because now the birds are going to be hunting you down and eating you. So it's more beneficial to actually be a red beetle. Right? So the red beetles aren't getting killed as often. So their genes are going to be more prominent in the population. So ultimately, over time, the green beetles have been selected against, and the brown or the red beetles have flourished. So over time, all the green beetles are going to die off, and there won't be any left. So this population has evolved from green to red beetles. So we've said before that evolution is accepted as a scientific theory, and what a scientific theory is. So scientific theory just means that it has been well documented by research. There's really not anything to kind of refute what we have on this concept, on this theory. So it's kind of one step away from just becoming a law, like the law of gravity. So based on careful and reasonable examination of facts, using experimentation and reasoning, so and having repeated results. So that's kind of the key of any scientific thought, is that you have to be able to repeat the results. So we don't have any kind of dissenting results from what we know about this theory. So as we know, there's an overwhelming body of evidence supporting the theory of evolution. So things like fossils, comparative anatomy, looking at how different body structures differ among species, embryology, biochemistry, genetics. So just remember FAME, right? So F for fossil evidence, right? So just remains of ancient organisms, evidence of ancient organisms. A for anatomical structures, so body parts can be a point of evidence for evolution. Molecular evidence, so genetic sequencing of DNA and RNA, as well as embryological evidence. So we know that embryos look very similar from one species to the next. So some of our very early evolutionary history is shared at some point. Right, so looking at fossils again, we said fossils just provide kind of that tangible evidence of this evolutionary change over time. So there's been several series of fossils that have been found that exhibit evolution of body structures over time. So we can kind of see this progression of species, so kind of this transition from different types of organisms, suggesting that new species have evolved from and ultimately replaced these previous species. So like this figure is the Archaeopteryx, which is kind of the missing link, considered the missing link between dinosaurs and bird evolution. Um, this is kind of one of the transitional species from, or to maybe modern alligators and crocodiles. And this, of course, is kind of the progression of human evolution. So we have kind of our early ancestors 1.6 million years ago, all the way to modern humans, and kind of see this progression and change over time. Another evolutionary series reveals kind of modern whales that we know have now evolved from once land-living organisms, land-living ancestors. So this is just kind of tracing back in terms of millions of years ago. So we have modern whales that we have today, that originated from this very similar whale-like organism. I mean, not quite like a whale, right? But then we go back further and further, and we can kind of trace back this progression, and see when it kind of transitioned from living on land with 4 legs to transitioning to a more aquatic habitat. So these considered these like missing link species, these transition species, are pretty rare to find fossils of. So like I said, the Archaeopteryx, kind of that missing link between dinosaurs and birds. But there are still actually a couple of these missing link species alive today. So this is a mud skipper. So you can see it looks kind of like a hybrid between a fish and a frog. So this is considered one of those kind of transitional species from fish to amphibian. So kind of when our evolutionary ancestors left the water for the land. Another example is the frogfish. So it's kind of the early evolution of from fish to amphibians, as well as growing limbs, so locomotion, walking on actual limbs as opposed to swimming with a fin. So comparative anatomy also gives us good evidence of this shared ancestry, or this descent with modification. So basically meaning that you've descended from your ancestors, but you've been slightly modified along the way throughout the generations. So we can compare bodies of different organisms, different species, and notice similarities that can only be explained if they have a common shared ancestry. So different body structures may be modified by evolution to serve different functions for different species. Right? So they live in different habitats, they have different selection pressures. So evolution, natural selection can kind of reshape and mold some of these structures, but they're still fundamentally going to be similar, due to that shared ancestry. So these are called homologous structures. So homo meaning same, so they have the same ancestry. So these are structures with the same evolutionary origin despite their current appearance or function. So a few examples, looking at the cross-section of an elephant's foot. So just looking at it from the outside, you might not, really think it was similar to a human's foot, but when we look at the actual bone structure, it is very similar to a human's foot. We have the same shape of bones, the same number of bones, the same arrangement of bones, but their foot has just been modified through evolution to suit the purpose of supporting their massive weights. So same thing looking at the upper arm bone of different mammals. So we all have the same basic upper limb bone structure, but it's been molded and shaped to suit different functions. So humans, we use our arms for grasping and reaching, but we have a humerus, your upper arm bone, the radius and ulna in the forearm, and then the wrist bones and the fingers. So looking at a cat, they also have a humerus, a radius and ulna, and the wrist bones and finger bones, phalanges, metacarpals. Same thing with a whale. So a whale is now an aquatic organism, but it's a mammal, so it's going to have that shared ancestry. So that means it's going to have those same bone structures. So because they don't really use their limbs for kind of weight-bearing locomotion, since they're aquatic, their bones are much reduced in structure. So but they still have a humerus, a radius, an ulna, carpals, wrist bones, and metacarpals and phalanges. So just they have very elongated phalanges or finger bones to make the structure of their fins, to make that wide paddle structure. Same thing with bats. Right? So humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. But again, their structure has been molded for the function of flight. Vestigial structures are another point of evidence for evolution. So vestigial structures are just inherited structures, but we no longer use these structures. So they have no apparent or essential function. So there are lots of examples of vestigial structures in nature. So some include molar teeth and vampire bats. So we know vampire bats have evolved to live entirely on blood. So they're called sanguivores. So they only eat blood. So why would they need teeth if they don't chew their food? Because their ancestors had teeth. So they still have those genes for teeth. Same thing with humans and wisdom teeth, right? So those are actually considered vestigial or useless structures in humans. So our ancestors had longer jaws than we currently do. So they had room for that extra set of teeth to chew their food, but we don't. So we just now remove the wisdom teeth. Pelvic bones in whales is another example of a vestigial structure. So obviously whales don't have legs, they don't walk, but they do still have remnants of that pelvic bone structure, that leg bone structure. Flightless birds are another one. So flightless birds, even though they don't fly, they still have wings, although their wings typically are going to be very, very small and reduced in size. So ultimately, as animals evolved into these new habitats, some of those structures were less useful, made them less fit, and ultimately over time were just reduced to the point of insignificance. So another example, a lot of cave organisms or deep sea organisms have no pigmentation or no eyes because there's absolutely no light down there. So why would they need pigmentation or eyes? As opposed to a surface fish, which does interact with the light. So that's why a lot of fish are reflective, have these shiny scales to help reflect the sunlight in the water. Some other vestigial structures in humans. So we still have rudimentary ear muscles. So some of our primate and mammal ancestors had more dexterity in their ears than we currently do, but we still have these very small, minuscule muscles near our ears. Also the tail vertebrae. So obviously we don't have tails anymore, but our primate ancestors did. So throughout evolution, since we don't need a tail, we still have the vertebrae. So we can't not produce the vertebrae, but we can kind of modify them and fuse them together and make them very small and virtually insignificant. The appendix is another considered vestigial organ. So it's very small, and you can live without it. So that means it's a non-essential structure. So again, comparative anatomy gives good evidence of this descent with modification or this evolution over time. So we said that some anatomical structures can be traced back to a shared ancestry, but there are some similarities we see that actually result from similar evolution pressures or similar environments and not actually a shared common genetic ancestry. So this is called a convergent evolution. So essentially, natural selection is going to cause these non-related structures to resemble one another because they serve similar functions. So nature's solution to flight is wings. So even though bats, birds, and insects all have wings, right, they're still different. So they're not due to a shared ancestry. So these evolved independently of one another. Same thing with fins, an aquatic shape of organisms. So we have aquatic fish, obviously, some aquatic reptiles, aquatic birds, aquatic mammals like dolphins and whales, but they all look very similar in structure because their bodies have similar functions to live in water. So they're going to have these flippers and this tail shape. So yeah, it's the parallel modification of two different structures. So again, these are called analogous structures. So again, homologous structures, homo meaning similar or the same. So these are derived from a similar ancestry, a genetic evolutionary shared history. Analogous are structures that are outwardly similar in appearance but differ in their evolutionary organisms. So this would be your convergent evolution. So again, the example of the flippers. So these analogous structures are typically very different in their internal anatomy because, again, they're not derived from that common ancestry. So even though all of the forelimbs of these different organisms are very different in their function, they're still based on that same arrangement of bones. So the humerus, the radius, the ulna, and the carpals and the fingers. Whereas these analogous structures, even though they're all flippers, the bone structure is very, very different between the four. So embryological similarity also gives evidence to this shared common ancestry. So pretty much all vertebrates, including fish, turtles, reptiles, birds, mammals, even humans, early in the embryological development develop tails and gill slits or gill grooves during these early developmental stages. So even though the adult form of the organisms are very different, the similarities in these very, very early beginning instructions of the embryos can only be explained by the fact that they all descend and share a common ancestor. So just looking at these embryos, you really wouldn't be able to tell which one's which, right? So this one's a human, this is a pig or a lemur. They're very, very similar and hard to separate apart at this point. So also our modern biotechnology, biochemical and genetic analysis reveal this relatedness among diverse organisms. So now we can kind of fill in the blanks of the entire evolutionary tree. So we notice lots of similarities, genetic similarities between different organisms. So generally, the more similar you are genetically, the more closely related you are to that organism. So like us humans, we share 98% of our DNA to chimpanzees. So they are our closest genetic modern relatives. 92% to a mouse, since we're both mammals. 44% to a fruit fly. So this just means that we share a common ancestor with insects and flies, but we branched off a bit further back than we did from the mice. So another interesting point with just genetic analysis is just looking at these two organisms, a elephant and a hyrax, a rock hyrax. You wouldn't really think they were close relatives, but actually the hyrax is one of the closest genetic relatives to modern elephants. So lots of surprises came out with our modern biotechnologies. So we also know that controlled breeding can modify organisms. So this is known as artificial selection or selective breeding. So we have been really manipulating selection for our own purposes since the dawn of man. So making domestic plants and animals to produce specific desirable features. So it's not necessarily going to benefit the plant to produce more seeds or an animal to produce more meat mass, muscle mass, but it does suit our purposes for our crop supply, our food supply. So in only a few thousand years since in human history, we have drastically modified lots of organisms, especially dogs. So evolution, natural selection has created wolves, which are very well adapted hunters and suitable for their environment. They have thick coats and survive the winter. They're very smart, have that pack behavior. So humans, with our intelligent design, have created pugs and other modern dog breeds that are virtually so inbred that they are now disfigured and have trouble breathing and even existing. So Another example looking at corn, so wild corn, very, very different from what modern corn looks like. So this is due to our selective breeding. So we're only going to save the seeds and plant next season of the plants that produce the most yield, the most fruits or vegetables. Same thing with chickens. So we have kind of artificially selected for rapid, massive growth of chickens. So in 1957, this was the average size of a 56-day-old chicken. 1978, right, they're a bit more bulky, and more modern, 2005, they are huge, right, like 3 times the size of the first chicken. So we also know that evolution by natural selection still occurs today. So there's lots of observations and experiments to provide additional evidence of this process of natural selection. So this is a really interesting case of trying to trace back kind of the domestication process of wolves into dogs. So in Russia, they have some Siberian foxes. So these are kind of the natural fox coats. So they set about to domesticate the foxes, kind of like our ancestors would have domesticated wolves for dogs. So they only select the most docile, the most friendly puppies or kits in Fox's case to reproduce for the next generation. And then in that second generation, they pick the most docile, most friendly puppies or kits for the next generation. So over several generations, they saw as the behaviors changed, became more dog-like, more friendly, more docile, less wild-like, like the original foxes. Some other phenotypic or physical changes occurred. So these are actually foxes that were several generations into the experiment, and their coat patterns have changed to resemble more like modern dogs, modern canines, which was pretty interesting. So another example is in cricket wings. So we know crickets chirp, crickets make noise. So in one particular location, they found that their crickets had stopped calling. So we were hearing fewer cricket calls. So the male crickets issue the call to try to attract a mate. So pretty much every bug and bird and animal that you hear chirping and chittering outside in nature, they're all trying to get laid. They're all trying to find a mate, right, attract a mate. But we looked at the wings of the normal crickets and some mutant crickets in the population and noticed that they were changing. So normally the male cricket wing would have this long rigid file that they would kind of grind against to make their song or their sound. But they were noticing that more males in the population had this kind of deformed or really small defective file, so they weren't able to make that loud song, that loud chirp or cricket sound. Basically, the male crickets were trying to find a mate and making this noisy, loud song. So there was a parasitic fly located in the area that was kind of tracking these crickets by their song. So over time, the crickets that were able to produce the song or the sound were getting killed by these parasitic flies. So the mutated crickets with the deformed wings weren't able to make the sound, so they were spared. They weren't found by the parasitic fly. So over time, their genes kind of repopulated and increased in the population. So we know that selection acts on this random variation, these mutations, to favor traits that work best in a particular environment. So again, it's going to favor the organism that is best suited or adapted to that particular habitat. So it doesn't really select for the best in the absolute sense, only for what is best in the context of that environment. Right, so environments and habitats can change. So this is what kind of drives these species to try to change and keep up with these environmental changes. And so we know some changes that we have to deal with evolution is pesticide and antibiotic resistance. So this figure here is basically a large petri plate. So we have a lot of agar here. So they've added different concentrations of antibiotic to each section on the table. So here, the first section is 0 antibiotic. The second block is 10% antibiotic, and then 20%, 30%, and so on. So what you see is the bacteria grow freely, until they hit this barrier of antibiotic. Right, so once they hit that barrier, one or two are able to get through. So one or two mutate is all it takes to repopulate. They hit the next barrier of antibiotic, but same thing. So one or two can mutate is all it takes. It comes through and repopulate. So over time, all of these bacteria are going to have those resistant genes. Right, so again, this is showing a bunch of bacteria, including one mutant that has now resistance to the antibiotic. So we treat with the antibiotic, it kills all of the normal bacteria, but that one mutant that happens to be resistant is going to survive. So it's going to survive and multiply and become more common in the population. So now the entire infection evolves into a resistant strain. So we can see the same thing happening with pesticide application. So all it really takes is for one mutant in the population to have some type of resistance gene. So we apply the pesticide, it kills all of the original beetles. Right? It only leaves the two that have that mutation. So now they're going to kind of repopulate, and now the entire population becomes resistant to our pesticides. So again, selection acts on our random variation to favor traits that work best in a particular environment. So these variations on which natural selection works are produced by chance mutations. Right? So that's really what's kind of driving evolution, and all the diversity we see today are mistakes. So thousands of mistakes built upon each other, mistakes in copying DNA and these chance mutations. So these mutations are going to confer different traits, disadvantages, or advantages to an organism. Natural selection is going to favor organisms with traits that are better adapted to a particular environment. So again, evolution does not act on an individual, but it is the change in a population over time. And this figure is just kind of showing general evolution to humans. So starting with some fish, amphibians, reptiles,